She was invisible to everyone on that bus, except to the one man who had everything to lose by seeing her. What happened next shattered every assumption about power, compassion, and the hidden threads that bind strangers across worlds that should never touch. Stay with me. What unfolds in the next moments isn't just a story. It's a mirror reflecting the quiet desperation we all carry, the exhaustion we hide, and the unexpected grace that can arrive when we least deserve it. The city bus rattled through rain-soaked streets as evening descended like a heavy curtain over the urban landscape. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting pale shadows across faces blank with fatigue. Commuters clutched phones and purses, lost in private worlds of worry and weariness. The air hung thick with the scent of wet fabric, cheap coffee, and the collective resignation of another day survived rather than lived. Among them sat a young woman whose story was written in every line of her hunched shoulders, every thread of her worn jacket, every shadow beneath her eyes that spoke of battles fought in silence. To the others on that bus, she was merely another body occupying space, another tired soul in a city that consumed souls like fuel. She pressed herself against the window, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass, watching streetlights blur into watercolor streaks as the bus lurched through intersections. Her uniform, a faded blue shirt with a name tag barely legible, carried the stains of a double shift at the diner, where she served plates of hope disguised as comfort food to people who, like her, were just trying to make it through another day. Her hands, raw and reddened from hours of scalding dishwater, clutched a small backpack that held everything of value she owned: a change of clothes, a worn paperback novel she'd read 17 times, and a photograph of a younger version of herself, smiling in front of a college she'd never be able to afford again. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, like an invisible hand crushing her chest. She'd been awake for nearly 22 hours, moving from one job to the next in an endless cycle that had become her entire existence. The morning had started at 5 with a cleaning shift at an office building downtown, her knees aching as she scrubbed floors that executives would walk across without a second thought. Then the diner, where she'd smiled through rudeness and stiffed tips, where she'd pretended the smell of grease didn't turn her stomach anymore, where she'd laughed at jokes that weren't funny because survival sometimes requires performance. Her feet throbbed in shoes held together with duct tape and stubborn willpower. Her back screamed from carrying trays heavier than they had any right to be, but she couldn't stop. Stopping meant falling behind on rent. Stopping meant choosing between electricity and food. Stopping meant admitting that the American dream she'd been promised was nothing more than a beautiful lie told to keep people like her running on a treadmill that went nowhere. As the bus swayed around another corner, her eyelids grew impossibly heavy. She fought against sleep with everything she had left, knowing she needed to stay alert, knowing she had 3 more stops before her neighborhood, knowing that falling asleep on public transportation was dangerous for someone like her, someone without armor or protection or the privilege of vulnerability. But exhaustion is a patient hunter, and eventually it always claims its prey. Her head began to nod forward, jerking back up in that familiar dance of the desperately tired. Once, twice, 3 times she caught herself, and then finally, her body surrendered to what her will could no longer resist. Her head tilted gently against the cold window, her breathing deepened, and she slipped into the kind of sleep that comes not from peace, but from absolute depletion. The other passengers barely noticed. In cities like this one, people become expert at not seeing what makes them uncomfortable. Poverty, exhaustion, suffering. These things exist in a parallel dimension that the fortunate train themselves to look through rather than at. An elderly woman glanced over, her eyes softening with recognition of shared struggle. But she said nothing. A teenager with headphones bobbed his head to music, oblivious. A middle-aged man in a suit scrolled through his phone, his face illuminated by the blue glow of a world more real to him than the one unfolding inches away. And then he boarded. At the next stop, the doors hissed open to admit a man who didn't belong on this bus, whose presence created an immediate disturbance in the atmosphere, like a wrong note in a familiar song. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, custom-tailored to fit shoulders that had never known manual labor. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the bus's dim lighting. His watch, discreet but unmistakable to those who recognized such things, was worth more than some people earned in a year. He carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives, someone accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered, someone whose name appeared in business journals and society pages. But something was different tonight. His driver had called in sick, and his usual car service had been unavailable, and for the first time in perhaps 15 years, he found himself on public transportation. It was meant to be an adventure, a brief walk on the other side, a story he might tell at dinner parties about staying connected to real people. He'd expected it to be amusing, perhaps even charming in a documentary sort of way. What he hadn't expected was to see her. He took a seat 3 rows behind her, settling onto the worn vinyl with visible discomfort. His eyes scanned the bus with the analytical gaze of someone who assessed value in everything, who calculated risk and opportunity as naturally as breathing. And then his attention stopped on the young woman asleep against the window. At first it was merely observation, the way one might notice any object in one's field of vision. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was the way her hand had fallen open on her lap, palm up in unconscious supplication. Perhaps it was the vulnerability etched into every line of her sleeping face, defenses dropped in a way they could never be while awake. Perhaps it was the recognition, buried deep in his own carefully constructed fortress of success, of a shared humanity he'd spent decades training himself to ignore. The bus continued its route, stopping and starting, passengers boarding and departing, the rhythm of urban transit playing out as it had thousands of times before. And still she slept, her head bouncing gently against the glass with each pothole, her body so thoroughly exhausted that even discomfort couldn't wake her. The man watched, and something uncomfortable began to stir in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to empathy, that felt like the beginning of a crack in the careful walls he'd built between himself and the suffering of others. 3 stops passed, then 4. The bus was emptying now as it moved toward neighborhoods where people struggled rather than thrived, where the American dream revealed itself as the mirage it had always been. And still she slept. The man glanced at his phone, checking the time, calculating his own schedule, his own needs, his own life waiting for him in a penthouse apartment where the view cost more per month than most people earned. He should get off at the next stop, call for a car, return to his world. This wasn't his concern. She wasn't his responsibility. The invisible lines that separated their worlds existed for a reason, and crossing them led to complications he didn't need. But he didn't move. He watched as her stop approached, recognizing it from the electronic display at the front of the bus. He watched as the bus began to slow. He watched as the doors prepared to open. And he watched as she continued to sleep, unaware that she was about to miss her destination, unaware that exhaustion had stolen from her even the small navigation she needed to make it home. What happened next would change everything, not just for her, but for him, in ways neither could possibly imagine. Sometimes the universe places us exactly where we need to be, even when, especially when, we don't want to be there. The doors hissed open. The driver announced the stop in a bored monotone that had announced 10,000 stops before. 2 passengers shuffled toward the exit, their faces illuminated briefly by streetlights before disappearing into the night. And still she slept, her body having claimed the rest it so desperately needed, oblivious to the fact that home was slipping away with every second that passed. The man sat frozen in his seat, watching this small tragedy unfold, feeling the weight of a decision he'd never imagined having to make. Pressing down on him like gravity itself had suddenly intensified. He could say nothing. He could let her sleep, let her miss her stop, let her wake up miles from where she needed to be in a city that showed no mercy to those who stumbled. It wasn't his problem. He'd built an empire by focusing on what mattered to him, by drawing clear boundaries between himself and the chaos of other people's lives. She was a stranger. Her struggles, however visible, were not his to carry. The rational part of his brain, the part that had negotiated billion-dollar deals and made decisions that moved markets, told him to stay silent, to look away, to preserve the comfortable distance between their worlds. But something else stirred in him, something older than ambition. deeper than success, more fundamental than the carefully constructed identity he'd spent a lifetime building. Perhaps it was the memory of his own mother, decades ago, falling asleep on a bus after working 3 jobs to keep him fed. Perhaps it was the ghost of the young man he'd once been, before wealth had insulated him from the sharp edges of reality, before power had given him the luxury of selective compassion. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that in this moment on this bus, stripped of titles and bank accounts and all the markers of status, they were just 2 human beings, and one of them needed help that only the other could provide. He stood. The movement felt significant, like crossing an invisible threshold from which there was no return. His legs carried him forward through the narrow aisle, past empty seats and the debris of other people's journeys, discarded transfer tickets and forgotten umbrellas, and the small evidences of lives lived in the margins. He moved toward her with the careful deliberation of someone approaching something fragile, something that might shatter if handled incorrectly. The bus driver glanced in the rearview mirror, impatient, ready to close the doors and continue the route. Time was collapsing into this single moment, this single choice. He reached her seat and paused, suddenly uncertain. How do you wake someone without startling them? How do you enter someone's vulnerability without violating it? In boardrooms, he commanded attention with a word. In negotiations, his voice could shift entire outcomes. But here, faced with a sleeping stranger, whose exhaustion was so complete it bordered on the sacred, he felt stripped of every tool he'd ever relied on. His hand hovered in the air between them, trembling slightly, and for the first time in years he felt truly afraid, not of losing money or status or power, but of causing harm, of being one more person who handled another's pain carelessly. "Miss," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, gentler than he'd spoken in years. She didn't stir. The word hung in the air, too quiet to penetrate the deep fortress of her sleep. He tried again, slightly louder, but still tender, still aware that exhaustion this profound deserved respect. "Miss, your stop." Still nothing. Her breathing remained slow and even, her face peaceful in a way that made him ache with recognition of how rare peace must be for her, how precious these stolen moments of unconsciousness. He did something then that surprised even himself. Rather than shaking her shoulder, rather than using the efficient, impersonal touch of someone trying to solve a problem quickly, he reached out and gently, so gently it was barely contact at all, touched her hand where it lay open on her lap. The gesture was intimate in a way that transcended romance or desire, intimate in the way that connecting with another human being's vulnerability is always intimate, always sacred, always a small act of courage in a world that teaches us to protect ourselves above all else. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying warmth he hadn't known he still possessed. "You're at your stop. Time to wake up." This time something registered. Her eyelids fluttered, consciousness returning in slow waves, the way dawn creeps across a landscape. She was caught in that strange space between sleeping and waking, where the world hasn't yet reformed its hard edges, where dreams and reality blur together into something surreal. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused, confused, taking in the face of a stranger hovering above her with an expression of concern that seemed impossible, seemed like it must be part of whatever dream she'd been having. For a moment they simply looked at each other. In that look 1,000 unspoken things passed between them. He saw her fear spike as awareness returned, saw her body tense with the trained wariness of someone who'd learned that unexpected attention usually meant danger. She saw him, really saw him, not just the expensive suit and the obvious markers of wealth, but something in his eyes that was genuine, that was kind, that was seeing her not as an obstacle or an object, but as a person worthy of care. It was a moment suspended outside normal time, a moment where 2 people from opposite ends of the human spectrum recognized their shared humanity. "Your stop," he repeated, stepping back to give her space to make clear he wasn't a threat. "I noticed you were asleep. Didn't want you to miss it." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of the choice he'd made, the invisible line he'd crossed, the small rebellion against a world that taught people like him to look away from people like her. She blinked, fully awake now, her brain scrambling to make sense of what was happening. She looked out the window, recognizing her corner store. The familiar graffiti on the wall across the street, the broken streetlight that the city had promised to fix for 3 years. "Oh God," she breathed, the words carrying relief and embarrassment in equal measure. She grabbed her backpack, fumbling with the straps, her movements clumsy with residual exhaustion and the disorientation of being woken from such deep sleep. "Thank you. I worked a double and I guess I just—" She trailed off, not wanting to explain her life to this stranger, not wanting his pity, but also genuinely grateful, touched by a kindness she hadn't expected and rarely received. "I understand," he said simply, and something in his voice suggested that maybe against all odds he actually did. "Take care of yourself." He stepped aside to let her pass, and she moved toward the door, her legs unsteady, her heart pounding with an emotion she couldn't quite name. As she stepped down onto the wet pavement, she turned back to look at him, this impossible stranger who'd shown her a sliver of human decency in a world that so often withheld it. Their eyes met one more time and she offered a small smile, genuine and warm despite her exhaustion, a smile that said more than words could. The doors closed between them. The bus pulled away, carrying him back toward his world while she stood on the corner, watching the taillights disappear into the rain. She was home. She was safe. And somewhere inside her, something had shifted. Some small belief in human goodness had been rekindled. Some tiny flame of hope had been sheltered from the wind, just long enough to keep burning. She didn't know his name. She would never see him again. But the memory of his gentle touch, his kind voice, his willingness to see her when everyone else looked through her, would stay with her through the dark nights ahead. Inside the bus, he returned to his seat, his heart beating faster than it should, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite organize. Such a small thing, waking someone up, making sure they got home safely. Such an insignificant act in the grand scheme of his life, in the context of the deals he brokered and the empires he built. And yet, it felt monumental. It felt like something had cracked open inside him, like a door he'd sealed shut years ago had been forced ajar, letting in light he'd forgotten existed. Sharing these stories isn't easy, but if you feel the weight of these small moments that change everything, if you've ever been the one who needed help or the one who chose to give it, subscribe and join us. Your like can spread empathy, and your comment can share a story that touches another soul. We're building something here, a community that believes in the power of human connection, in the significance of small kindnesses, in the truth that we're all more connected than the world wants us to believe. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Days passed, then a week, and still her face haunted him in unexpected moments. During board meetings where numbers scrolled across screens, during dinners at restaurants where a single meal cost more than her daily wages, during sleepless nights in his penthouse where the city sprawled below him like a glittering constellation of other people's lives. He told himself it was nothing, just a brief encounter that had caught him off guard, a momentary lapse in the protective numbness he'd cultivated over decades of ruthless success. But the truth was more complicated, more uncomfortable, more insistent than he wanted to admit. That single moment on the bus had opened something inside him that refused to close. Suddenly he saw them everywhere. The invisible people who kept his world running, the workers who cleaned his office after midnight, the delivery drivers who brought packages to his building, the servers who poured his coffee without ever making eye contact. They'd always been there, of course, background characters in the story he told himself about his own importance. But now he couldn't unsee them. Now he noticed the exhaustion in their eyes, the worn shoes, the careful budgeting visible in every choice they made. Now he wondered about their stories, their struggles, their moments of falling asleep on buses because their bodies simply couldn't continue. What had he become? The question arrived uninvited at 3 a.m, cutting through the comfortable narratives he'd built about merit and hard work and deserving success. Yes, he'd worked hard. Yes, he'd made smart decisions. Yes, he'd earned his position through talent and determination, but he'd also been lucky in ways he'd never acknowledged, born with advantages he'd never examined, lifted by systems designed to lift people like him while grinding down people like her. The realization didn't make him feel generous or noble. It made him feel complicit, ashamed, aware of how much suffering he'd ignored in the single-minded pursuit of more. His assistant noticed the change first. He started asking questions about the company's labor practices, about wages paid to cleaning staff and cafeteria workers, about benefits and working conditions for the lowest level employees. He requested reports on turnover rates, on healthcare coverage, on whether people could actually survive on what his company paid them. The questions made people uncomfortable. They disrupted the careful equilibrium where everyone could pretend that poverty wages were just market forces, just the way things worked, just nobody's fault and therefore nobody's responsibility. His executives shifted in their seats, exchanged glances, wondered what had happened to the man who'd always focused ruthlessly on profit margins and shareholder value. He couldn't explain it to them. How could he articulate that a sleeping stranger on a bus had dismantled everything he thought he understood about the world? How could he make them feel what he'd felt in that moment when he'd touched her hand and recognized, really recognized, that her exhaustion was the foundation his comfort was built on? So he didn't try to explain. He just started making changes, quietly at first, raising minimum wages for contracted workers, improving benefits, creating scholarship programs for employees' children. The board questioned him. Shareholders grumbled about reduced profits. Business analysts wrote articles questioning his judgment. But something else happened too. Workers who'd never expected to be seen suddenly found themselves visible. Single mothers discovered they could afford childcare. Students realized they might actually finish degrees they'd abandoned. People stopped having to choose between medicine and food, between rent and electricity, between survival and dignity. And word spread, the way word always spreads among those who live close to the edge, that something had shifted, that someone with power had decided to use it differently, that maybe the world didn't have to be as cruel as they'd been taught to accept. He never told anyone about the girl on the bus. It felt too personal, too private, too much like exposing something sacred. But he thought about her constantly, wondered if his changes had reached her somehow, hoped that maybe her life had gotten even fractionally easier. He found himself taking the bus occasionally, always in the evening when workers headed home after long shifts, always watching faces, always looking for her, even though he knew the chances were impossibly small in a city of millions. He never saw her again, but he saw thousands like her, and each face was a reminder of the choice he'd made, the door he'd opened, the person he was trying to become. Then came the day everything changed again. 6 months after that rainy evening, he attended a company event, one of those mandatory gatherings where executives mingled with employees in a staged performance of corporate unity. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, making small talk, playing the role he'd perfected over decades. And then he saw her. She was standing near the refreshment table, wearing a simple dress that was clean but clearly second-hand, her hair pulled back, her face still carrying that same exhaustion, but something else too, something lighter, something that might have been hope. His heart stopped. Time compressed into a single point of impossible coincidence. She was here, in his building, at his company's event. How? Why? The questions tumbled over each other as he watched her, frozen in place, unable to move or speak or do anything but stare. She was talking to someone, smiling, that same genuine smile she'd given him on the bus, and he felt something crack open in his chest, something that felt like fate or destiny or the universe insisting on completing a story that had seemed finished. He moved toward her without conscious decision, his legs carrying him through the crowd as if pulled by invisible strings. She didn't see him at first, engaged in conversation with a co-worker, laughing at something that lit up her entire face. He waited, patient, aware that he was about to step into something significant, something that would matter in ways he couldn't predict. When there was a pause in her conversation, when she turned slightly and her eyes swept the room, their gazes met. Recognition hit her like a physical force. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly, her whole body tensed with the shock of seeing him again, here, in this impossible context. For a moment, neither of them moved, connected across the crowded room by the memory of that rainy evening, by the kindness he'd shown and the gratitude she'd felt, by the invisible thread that had apparently been pulling them back together all along. Then he smiled, gentle and warm. the same expression he'd worn when he'd touched her hand and woken her carefully, and she smiled back, tentative but real. He crossed the remaining distance between them, aware that people were watching, aware that this moment was unfolding in front of dozens of witnesses, aware that whatever happened next would ripple outward in ways that mattered. "Hello," he said simply, and his voice carried the same gentleness it had that night, the same respect, the same recognition of her worth. "I don't know if you remember, but we met on a bus. You'd fallen asleep, and I woke you at your stop." Her hand flew to her mouth, emotions flooding her face, surprise and embarrassment and something deeper, something grateful and moved. "Oh my God," she whispered, loud enough only for him to hear. You work here. She trailed off as understanding dawned, as she connected the man from the bus with the CEO, whose portrait hung in the lobby, whose name was on the building, whose recent policy changes had transformed her life in ways he couldn't possibly know. "I do," he said, watching the realization play across her features. "And it seems you do too now. When did you start?" His question was genuine, interested, free of the condescension that so often infected conversations between people of different status. She was still processing, still trying to make sense of this impossible coincidence, still adjusting to the fact that the stranger who'd shown her kindness turned out to be the person who'd recently made it possible for her to afford community college classes, who'd implemented the policy that gave her healthcare for the first time in years, who'd somehow, impossibly, changed her life twice without even knowing it. If you believe in moments like these, in the strange ways the universe connects us, in the power of kindness to ripple forward in time, then stay with us. Subscribe to hear more stories of unexpected grace. Comment with your own moments when strangers changed everything. Like this video if you believe we're all more connected than we know. We're building something here, a community that refuses to accept that indifference is inevitable, that sees the sacred in small acts of attention, that believes one person really can matter. She found her voice, though it trembled with the weight of everything she wanted to say and couldn't quite articulate. 3 months ago, she managed, her words coming slowly, as if she were navigating unfamiliar territory. "I got accepted into the employee development program, the new one that covers tuition. I'm studying business administration at night, working in the mailroom during the day. It's changed everything for me." Her eyes glistened with tears she was fighting to hold back, tears that came from a place deeper than simple gratitude, from the profound relief of someone who'd been drowning and suddenly found solid ground beneath her feet. He felt something shift in his chest, a sensation both painful and beautiful. The realization that his changes had reached her, that the door he'd opened that night on the bus had led to this moment, to her standing here with hope in her eyes, instead of just exhaustion. "I'm glad," he said, and the simplicity of the words couldn't contain the enormity of what he felt. "I'm so glad. You deserve every opportunity, every chance to build the life you want." He meant it with an intensity that surprised him, this investment in the well-being of someone he barely knew, this fierce protective instinct toward her success. The conversation around them had quieted. People were watching now, curious about this exchange between the CEO and a mailroom employee, sensing something significant in the way they looked at each other, in the unusual warmth of his attention, in her obvious emotion. Whispers started, speculation began, but neither of them noticed or cared. They existed in a bubble outside normal corporate hierarchy, connected by something that transcended titles and salaries and all the artificial structures that separated human beings into categories of worth. "That night," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly, "I was at the end of everything. I'd been working 20-hour days for weeks, barely sleeping, barely eating, just trying to stay afloat. I'd actually been thinking, right before I fell asleep, that maybe I should just give up, move back to my hometown, admit that I couldn't make it here. And then you woke me, so gently, like I mattered, like I was a person worth caring about, not just another invisible body taking up space. You have no idea what that meant to me, what it still means." The tears escaped now, rolling down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. He felt his own eyes burning, felt the careful control he'd maintained for decades threatening to crack completely. "I think I do know," he said quietly. "That night changed me too. I'd spent so long not seeing people, not really seeing them, just moving through the world focused on my own goals, my own success, my own importance. And then, there you were, exhausted from working yourself to the bone, and I realized that everything I had was built on the backs of people like you, people who deserved so much more than I'd ever bothered to notice or care about. You woke something in me that night, something I'd buried for a long time." The honesty between them was raw, uncomfortably intimate for a corporate event, for a public space, for two people who were supposed to maintain professional distance. But some moments demand authenticity. Some connections insist on being acknowledged, regardless of context or convention. They stood there, CEO and employee, man and woman, two human beings who touched each other's lives in ways that defied logic or explanation, and let the truth of it simply exist between them. "The changes you've made," she continued, her voice stronger now, "they've saved people. Not just me, but dozens, maybe hundreds of us who were barely surviving. The wage increases, the healthcare, the education programs, they're not just policies, they're lifelines. They're the difference between hopelessness and possibility. I don't know what inspired you to do it, but thank you. Thank you for seeing us, for caring, for using your power to make things better instead of just making yourself richer." Her words carried the weight of an entire class of workers who rarely got to speak directly to those who controlled their fate, who rarely got to name what they needed or express what they felt. He shook his head slowly, humbled by her gratitude, aware that he'd done only a fraction of what needed doing, aware that changing a few policies didn't absolve him of decades of indifference or dismantle the systems that created such vast inequality in the first place. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "If anything, I should thank you for reminding me what matters, for showing me that success without compassion is just elaborate emptiness. I still have so far to go, so much more to learn about how to do this better, how to create real equity instead of just slightly less brutal exploitation. But I'm trying. Because of you, because of that night, I'm trying." Someone approached them then, one of his vice presidents, uncomfortable with this extended conversation, this breach of normal corporate protocol, this display of emotion that felt dangerous in its authenticity. "Sir, there are some people you should meet." The interruption came wrapped in professional courtesy, but carrying clear intention to separate them, to restore proper boundaries, to end whatever this was before it became more complicated. He waved the man away with unusual sharpness, unwilling to let this moment be cut short by the demands of performance and propriety. "I want you to know something," he said to her, ignoring the hovering executive, focusing entirely on her face, on making sure she heard and understood what he was about to say. "Your success here won't be because I remember you from the bus. It will be because of your talent, your work ethic, your intelligence. But if you ever need anything, if you ever face obstacles that seem insurmountable, if you ever feel invisible again, my door is open. Not as a favor, not as charity, but because we're connected now, because that night on the bus linked us in ways that matter, because I believe you're going to do extraordinary things, and I want to witness it, support it, if I can." She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat, aware that she was being given something precious, something rare, the genuine attention and investment of someone with the power to open doors that had always been locked to people like her. It wasn't romantic, though observers might interpret it that way. It wasn't transactional, though cynics would look for ulterior motives. It was simply human, two people recognizing each other across the vast distances that society insisted separated them, choosing connection over isolation, choosing to matter to each other in a world that constantly preached indifference. The party continued around them. Eventually they separated, returned to their respective roles, moved through the evening as corporate events demanded. But something had been established, some bond had been named and acknowledged, some promise had been made that extended beyond that single night. In the weeks and months that followed, she threw herself into her studies with renewed purpose, knowing she was working not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever fallen asleep on a bus from exhaustion, everyone who'd ever been invisible, everyone who'd ever needed someone with power to choose kindness. And he continued changing policies, pushing back against board resistance, insisting that a company could be profitable without crushing the people who made that profit possible. They didn't become close friends. The distance between their positions, their backgrounds, their life experiences was too vast for easy intimacy. But they remained aware of each other, connected by that original moment and by what it had catalyzed in both their lives. Sometimes he'd see her in the building, always moving with purpose now, no longer hunched with exhaustion, and he'd feel a spark of something that might have been pride or hope, or simply the satisfaction of knowing that one small act of attention had mattered. Sometimes she'd pass his office and remember the gentle touch on her hand, the kind voice waking her, the moment when a stranger had chosen to see her, and she'd feel grateful not just for what he'd given her, but for what that moment had taught her about her own worth. Years later, when she graduated with honors and was promoted to management, when she implemented her own policies to support struggling workers, when she paid forward the kindness that had changed her trajectory, she would think of that rainy evening as the night her life split into before and after. And he, watching her rise, watching her become exactly the leader he'd hoped she might be, would understand that the real gift hadn't been his kindness to her, but her gift to him, the reminder that beneath all the structures of power and wealth and status, we're just humans stumbling through this difficult world, occasionally given the chance to matter to each other, occasionally brave enough to take it. This was the journey of one soul, but thousands of others wait to be told. If you've ever felt the pain of being invisible or the grace of unexpected kindness, if you believe that small moments can change everything, if you want to be part of a community that celebrates our shared humanity, then join us. Subscribe to hear more stories that matter. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about the moments when strangers became angels, when exhaustion gave way to hope, when someone saw you when you needed it most. Like this video if you believe we're all connected in ways that matter, in ways that call us to be better, kinder, more attentive to each other. Together we celebrate not just survival, but the possibility of thriving, not just individual success, but collective flourishing, not just the life we have, but the world we could build if we chose compassion over indifference. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing that stories like this one matter, because they do, because we all do, because every single person carries a universe inside them worthy of attention, respect, and care.